The door closed with a sound that would echo through legal proceedings for months. January 6th, 1540. A bitter cold night at Greenwich Palace. The kind of cold that seeps through stone walls and settles into your bones. Inside the royal bedchamber, two figures stood in candlelight, the King of England and his new bride, Anne of Cleves. But here's what makes this moment different from every other royal wedding night in Tudor history. Outside that door, nothing, no one. Henry VIII had dismissed every single witness, every attendant, every courtier, every nobleman who should have been waiting in the antechamber to verify what happened next. Gone, all of them, and that absence, that calculated, deliberate absence, would become the most important evidence in a court case that hadn't happened yet. 6 months later, when Henry wanted out of this marriage, he would point to this very night. He would say the marriage was never consummated. And Anne of Cleves, she couldn't prove otherwise, because there was no one there to see, no one to testify, no one to defend her truth against the word of a king. What you're about to hear isn't just a story about a failed marriage. It's about how the most intimate moment in a person's life could be turned into a legal weapon. How witnesses at a bedding ceremony weren't there for voyeuristic tradition. They were there as protection. Protection that Henry VIII deliberately removed, because he already knew, standing in that candlelit chamber with a bride he'd barely met, that he was going to need an escape route. Welcome to Hearts and History, where we explore the moments that shaped us. If you enjoy stories like this one, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss our next journey into the past. Now, let's go back to that January night, to a kingdom desperate for heirs, and a king who had already decided his fourth marriage was temporary. To understand what Henry did on his wedding night, you have to understand what he'd already been through. By 1540, this man had lived multiple lifetimes of marital drama. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had given him 20 years and only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. Henry had torn England from the Catholic Church, declared himself head of a new religious order, and endured years of papal excommunication, all to annul that marriage and try again for a son. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, had promised him male heirs. She'd given him another daughter, Elizabeth, and then she'd given him nothing but stillbirths and disappointments. He'd had her head cut off on Tower Green, accused of adultery and treason, crimes most historians believe she never committed. His third wife, Jane Seymour, she was the one who finally delivered what Henry wanted. A son, Edward, born October 1537 at Hampton Court Palace. But Jane paid for that son with her life. She died 12 days after the birth, probably from puerperal fever, though some accounts suggest complications from the difficult delivery. So here was Henry in late 1539, nearly 50 years old, which was ancient by Tudor standards, growing heavier by the month. A leg wound from a jousting accident that had never properly healed, festering and causing him constant pain. He had his precious male heir, but Edward was a sickly child, and everyone at court knew that a single surviving son was not enough to secure a dynasty. The Wars of the Roses had ended only 50 years earlier. Living memory still held stories of what happened when succession was uncertain. Civil war, noble families torn apart, blood in the streets of London. Henry needed more sons, which meant Henry needed another wife. Enter Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Henry's break with Rome, the man who had dissolved the monasteries and filled the royal treasury with church wealth. Cromwell understood something about Henry that others missed. The king didn't just need a wife, he needed an alliance. England had broken with Catholic Europe, and Catholic Europe was not happy about it. The Pope had declared Henry a heretic. Spain and France, those perpetual rivals, were suddenly making peace with each other, and when Spain and France made peace, they usually found a common enemy. In 1539, that enemy looked a lot like England. Cromwell's solution was elegant. Marry Henry to a German Protestant princess. The German Protestant states were also enemies of the Pope, also outside the Catholic fold. An alliance through marriage would give England friends on the continent, a united Protestant front against Catholic aggression, and Cromwell had the perfect candidate, Anne of Cleves, sister to the Duke of Cleves, from a strategically positioned territory on the Lower Rhine. The Duchy of Cleves wasn't just Protestant, it controlled crucial trade routes. It was allied with the powerful Schmalkaldic League of German princes. A marriage to Anne would embed England in a network of Protestant alliances that could counter any Catholic threat. But Henry had a problem. He refused to marry anyone he hadn't seen first. He'd heard horror stories of princes trapped in marriages to ugly wives. He'd heard how the French king had been promised a beautiful Spanish princess and received something quite different. Henry was vain despite his own declining looks, and he wasn't about to commit to a woman based solely on diplomatic dispatches. So Cromwell commissioned a portrait. Hans Holbein the Younger was the finest portrait painter in England. German-born, trained in the Renaissance tradition, he had an eye for detail that made his subjects seem to breathe on canvas. He'd painted Thomas More. He'd painted Thomas Cromwell himself. His portraits were so accurate that people who'd never met his subjects could recognize them on the street, or so everyone believed. Cromwell sent Holbein to Cleves in the summer of 1539. "Paint the princess," he instructed. "Paint her accurately. The king will make his decision based on your work." What Holbein painted was a pleasant-looking woman, dark hair pulled back from her face, a square jaw that suggested strength rather than delicacy, eyes that looked directly at the viewer with a calm, serious expression. She wasn't a great beauty by the standards of the time. She wasn't Helen of Troy, but she wasn't ugly either. She looked fine, acceptable, dignified. Henry studied the portrait. He consulted his advisors. The diplomatic advantages were clear. The portrait was acceptable. In October 1539, he agreed to the match. The marriage contract was signed by proxy. Anne of Cleves would travel to England, and sometime after Christmas, she would become Queen of England. What happened next is one of history's great disasters of expectation. Anne arrived at Deal in Kent on December 27th, 1539. She'd been travelling for weeks, crossing the German states, passing through Calais, finally making the Channel crossing in rough winter seas. She was exhausted, probably seasick, definitely overwhelmed. She'd never left her homeland before. She spoke no English. French was the language of diplomacy, but Anne's French was limited at best. She'd been raised in strict seclusion, educated only in domestic skills, needlework, household management, the quiet virtues expected of a German noblewoman. She knew nothing of music, nothing of the courtly games and flirtations that were currency in the English court. Henry couldn't wait. This was supposed to be the romantic part. In the chivalric tradition, a king would disguise himself as a commoner and visit his bride-to-be incognito. She would recognize him anyway, through some mystical connection of love. They would embrace. The disguise would fall away. True love would triumph over deception. Henry loved this nonsense. He'd done it before. So on New Year's Day 1540, he rode to Rochester with a small party of men, all disguised in matching cloaks. They arrived at the bishop's palace where Anne was resting. Henry burst into her chamber unannounced, wearing his disguise, expecting, what? Recognition? Swooning? Some fairy tale moment where she would look past the costume and see the king within? What he got was a confused German woman who had no idea who this large, aging man was or why he was in her chamber. Anne barely looked at him. She was watching a bull-baiting display from the window, and this interruption annoyed her. She didn't recognize Henry. She couldn't. She'd never seen him. And even if she'd had some portrait to study, the man in front of her bore little resemblance to the athletic young king of 20 years earlier. Henry was mortified. The romantic narrative he'd constructed in his head collapsed completely. He withdrew, changed into his royal attire, returned to present himself officially. Now Anne knew who he was. Now she made the proper courtesies. But the damage was done. Henry had seen her, truly seen her, and whatever the portrait had suggested, the reality fell short. He told Cromwell that night, in terms that would prove prophetic, that he liked her not. Those words would haunt Cromwell for the remaining months of his life. Henry described Anne's face as unpleasing. He complained about her manner, calling her different from what had been reported. He said he saw nothing in this woman that could stir him to the marital act. But here was the problem. The marriage contract was signed, the diplomatic arrangements were in place. Anne's brother, the Duke of Cleves, had committed his territory to an alliance with England. To reject Anne now would be a massive diplomatic insult. It might push Cleves toward reconciliation with the Catholic powers. It might make England's enemies stronger. War might follow. Cromwell urged patience. Perhaps the king would warm to Anne once they were married. Perhaps in the intimacy of the bedchamber, attraction would spark. Perhaps duty would overcome distaste. Henry was not optimistic, but he saw no way out. The machinery of the wedding ground forward. January 6th, 1540, the Feast of the Epiphany, a Tuesday. The wedding took place at Greenwich Palace, in the Chapel Royal. Anne wore cloth of gold, her hair loose around her shoulders, in the style of a virgin bride. Henry wore his finest, though by now he wore his finery like armour against the world, trying to project a magnificence his body no longer possessed. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, performed the ceremony. The vows were exchanged, the rings presented. By early afternoon, Anne of Cleves was legally, bindingly, Queen of England. What happened next would normally be the most documented event of any royal wedding, the bedding ceremony. This wasn't prurient curiosity or medieval voyeurism. It was legal necessity built into the structure of how royal marriages functioned. Too much depended on whether a royal marriage was consummated, the legitimacy of future children, the validity of the marriage itself, the terms of treaties signed in good faith by foreign powers. A marriage that wasn't consummated wasn't really a marriage at all, not in the eyes of church or state. It could be annulled, set aside, treated as though it never happened. This is why witnesses mattered. Consider what a standard royal bedding ceremony looked like. The evidence from other Tudor weddings shows an elaborate formal, deeply public ritual. After the wedding feast, which could last for hours, the bride would be escorted to the bedchamber by her ladies-in-waiting. They would help her undress, put her in her nightclothes, arrange her hair. They would examine her for any deformities or marks that might have been hidden during courtship. They would confirm she was who she claimed to be. Meanwhile, the groom would be attended by his gentlemen. They would help him undress. They would often make bawdy jokes at his expense, the kind of masculine ribbing that accompanied every wedding across every social class. They would escort him to the bedchamber where his bride waited. A bishop or priest would bless the bed. Sometimes he would bless the couple as they lay in it. The highest-ranking nobles would serve as witnesses to the bedding itself, not watching the actual consummation, but being present in the room until the couple was settled, and then waiting immediately outside, close enough to hear, close enough to later testify, if necessary, that they had heard the sounds of the marital act, or at least that the couple had been alone together for sufficient time. In some European courts, the witnessing was even more direct. The sheets would be examined the next morning for blood that proved the bride's virginity had been taken. Ambassadors would wait outside the door all night, ready to send word to their home courts the moment consummation was confirmed. Treaties sometimes contained clauses that didn't take effect until consummation occurred. This sounds invasive to modern ears, and it was, but it served a purpose. It protected the bride by making the marriage unquestionable. Once consummated before witnesses, a marriage couldn't simply be set aside because the groom changed his mind. It protected the groom by establishing that any future children were legitimate. No one could later claim the heir wasn't really his. It protected both kingdoms involved by ensuring the alliance was truly sealed. The witnesses were there for verification, for proof, for the protection of everyone involved. When Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon in 1509, the protocols were followed precisely. Spanish ambassadors had travelled with Catherine for years, and they insisted on proper procedure. England needed Spain's alliance, and Spain needed confirmation that the marriage was real. Witnesses were present, the bed was blessed, every formality was observed. When Henry married Anne Boleyn in secret in 1533, there were still witnesses, fewer because the marriage was controversial and had to be hidden from those who still considered Catherine of Aragon the rightful queen, but witnesses nonetheless. Thomas Cranmer was present. A small group of trusted courtiers knew. Evidence existed. When Henry married Jane Seymour in 1536, just 11 days after Anne Boleyn's execution, witnesses confirmed the marriage's consummation. Jane was carrying the weight of the entire Tudor dynasty on her shoulders. Everyone needed to know, definitively, that any child she bore would be legitimate. These were the protocols. These were the expectations. Every royal marriage in Henry's lifetime had followed them. Every bedding ceremony had included witnesses, blessings, formal attendance. This was how it was done. This was how it had to be done. On January 6th, 1540, Henry threw all of it away. The accounts come from testimony given later, during the annulment proceedings. Multiple witnesses described what happened that night. The most detailed comes from Sir Anthony Denny, one of Henry's closest gentleman attendants, who would later become Groom of the Stool, the king's most intimate servant. Denny was there, he saw what happened, and what happened was unprecedented. After the wedding feast, Henry and Anne were escorted toward the bedchamber. So far, normal protocol. The ladies attended Anne, the gentlemen attended Henry, prayers were said, the bed had been prepared. But then, at the threshold of the bedchamber, Henry gave orders, direct orders. Everyone was to leave, immediately, not wait in the antechamber, not stand outside the door, not remain nearby in case they were needed. Leave, all of them. Denny would later describe his confusion. This wasn't done. This wasn't how royal weddings worked. But Henry was emphatic. He wanted privacy, complete privacy. No attendants within earshot. No witnesses who might later be called to testify about what they heard or didn't hear. The courtiers looked at each other. No one was going to argue with Henry VIII in January 1540. This was a man who had executed a queen, who had destroyed monasteries that had stood for centuries, who had broken with the Pope himself. If he wanted privacy on his wedding night, he would have privacy. They withdrew. The door closed. And in that closing door, in that deliberate removal of witnesses, Henry VIII created the conditions for his fourth annulment. He just hadn't filed the paperwork yet. Think about what this meant. For Anne, standing in that candlelit chamber with a man she barely knew, a man who had shown obvious displeasure at her appearance. From the moment he first saw her, she was now completely alone. No advocates, no witnesses, no one who could later confirm or deny what happened. Whatever Henry claimed about this night, she would have no way to contradict him. Her word against the word of a king. In Tudor England, that wasn't a contest, it was a formality. For Henry, the privacy served multiple purposes. First, obviously, if he couldn't perform, if the sight of Anne left him unable to consummate the marriage, no one would know. No embarrassing whispers would circulate through the court. His masculine reputation would remain intact. But second, and more importantly, if he later decided he wanted out of this marriage, he had created the perfect conditions. No consummation meant no valid marriage, and no witnesses meant no one could prove consummation had occurred. Was Henry thinking this clearly on his wedding night? Some historians doubt it. They suggest he simply wanted to avoid humiliation, that the deliberate legal strategy emerged only later, but others point to Henry's long history of marital manipulation. He had spent years building a case against Catherine of Aragon. He had manufactured charges against Anne Boleyn. He understood how annulments worked. He knew what evidence mattered. and he knew that on a wedding night, in a bedchamber, alone with a bride no one would later believe or support, he was in complete control of the narrative. The morning after the wedding, courtiers waited for the traditional announcement. In royal marriages, the groom typically emerged with some confirmation that the marriage had been consummated, sometimes explicit, sometimes implied, but confirmation, proof that the alliance was sealed, that future children would be legitimate, that everything had gone according to plan. Henry said nothing about consummation. He emerged from the bedchamber, looking, according to witnesses, sullen and displeased. When asked by his closest advisers how the night had gone, he complained about Anne, but he didn't say the marriage was consummated. He didn't say it wasn't. What he did, almost immediately, was begin confiding to select individuals that he found Anne repulsive. Thomas Cromwell was among the first to hear. Cromwell, who had arranged this marriage, who had staked his political career on its success, now heard his king describe the Queen as having neither good breasts nor maidenhead. Henry told Cromwell he could not bring himself to complete the marital act. He had touched her body, he claimed, and the feel of it had so repulsed him that he could not continue. Within days, Henry was telling his physician, Dr. William Butts, received a detailed account of the king's wedding night experiences, or lack thereof. Henry explained that he had tried. He had laid with Anne. He had put his hands on her. But some combination of her body's characteristics and his own physical reaction made consummation impossible. He couldn't maintain the necessary response. He blamed Anne's sagging breasts. He blamed her body odour. He blamed some indefinable quality that simply killed any arousal he might have felt. But here's the critical detail. To these same confidants, Henry emphasized that he remained physically capable. He described having nocturnal emissions. He boasted that with other women he had no difficulties. The problem wasn't him. The problem was Anne. Specifically, the problem was Anne's body. He was building a case, carefully, deliberately, laying the foundation for an annulment that wouldn't threaten his masculine reputation but would definitively end the marriage. Not impotent, just unable to be aroused by this particular woman, not his failure, her unsuitability. And Anne, what did she know? What did she understand about the situation she was in? The answer is devastating. Anne knew almost nothing. Her upbringing in Cleves had been strict, conservative, protective. Unmarried women of noble birth were kept entirely ignorant of sexual matters. This wasn't unusual for the time. Many noble women entered marriage with only the vaguest understanding of what was expected of them. But Anne's ignorance was extreme even by 16th century standards. She had no mother to guide her. Her father had died years earlier. The women around her, the attendants from Cleves, who had travelled with her to England, may have shared some basic information, but how much, and in what terms? There's evidence that Anne genuinely did not understand what consummation meant. She didn't know that sleeping beside someone wasn't the same as consummating a marriage. She didn't know that kisses and kind words weren't enough. When her German attendants asked her, some time after the wedding, whether she was truly married, whether the marriage had been properly completed, Anne said yes. Of course, she was the queen, wasn't she? The king kissed her good night. He called her darling. They slept in the same bed. What more was required? The attendants must have exchanged horrified glances. They tried to probe further. Did the king do anything else? Did anything happen beyond sleeping? Anne described their interactions. The king would kiss her. He would say good night. He would sleep. In the morning, he would rise and leave. That was all. She thought that was marriage. She thought that was what wives experienced. She had no framework for understanding that something was deeply wrong. This ignorance wasn't Anne's fault. It was the product of her upbringing, her culture, her protected status as a noble virgin. But in the context of Tudor England, in the context of a king who was already building a legal case for annulment, Anne's ignorance was catastrophic. She couldn't advocate for herself because she didn't know she needed to. She couldn't demand witnesses or documentation because she didn't understand what was at stake. She couldn't even accurately describe what happened on her wedding nights because she didn't know what should have happened. Henry had wanted privacy because he didn't want witnesses who could testify about consummation. But he got something even better. He got a wife who couldn't even testify accurately about her own experience. Anne's very innocence became evidence against her. When she later described her marriage to investigators, her account would make clear that she had no idea what consummation meant. The doctors who examined her would confirm she was still a virgin. 6 months of marriage, and she remained physically unchanged. This was Henry's wedding night strategy in full bloom. Remove the witnesses who might have protected Anne, exploit her ignorance to ensure she couldn't protect herself. Build the case, witness by witness, confidant by confidant, that this marriage had never been real. All of it began on January 6th, 1540. All of it began with a door closing on an empty antechamber. The weeks following the wedding established a pattern. Henry and Anne would appear together at court functions. They would sit together at meals. They would play the role of king and queen with reasonable success. Anne was learning English quickly. She was kind, gentle, undemanding. The court generally liked her. She wasn't the sparkling presence that Anne Boleyn had been, but she also wasn't the dangerous competitor that had made so many enemies. Anne of Cleves was simply pleasant, but in private, Henry continued to confide his disappointments to Cromwell, to his physicians, to anyone whose later testimony might matter. He tried, he said. He truly tried, but something about Anne prevented him from performing his marital duties. He would lie with her. He would attempt to work up the necessary enthusiasm, and then, nothing. He remained unable, yet he was still having nocturnal emissions, he insisted, still capable with other imagined partners. The problem was Anne, only Anne. Meanwhile, Anne continued in her gentle ignorance. She was learning to be an English queen, learning the customs, the language, the protocols of her new court, learning which ladies she could trust, which courtiers had power. She seemed content. She had no idea that her husband was systematically building a case for ending their marriage. She had no idea because she didn't know what a real marriage looked like. She had nothing to compare her experience against. How could she know something was wrong when she didn't know what right looked like? This is what makes Henry's strategy so devastating. He exploited Anne's innocence as thoroughly as he exploited the absence of witnesses. Both were forms of protection that should have helped her. Both were deliberately neutralized by a king who understood exactly how the legal system worked and how to make it work for him. Think about what Anne had available to her as protection. First, witnesses at the bedding ceremony. Gone, dismissed by Henry's direct order. Second, her own testimony about what happened. Useless because she didn't understand what should have happened. Third, physical evidence of consummation. Non-existent because consummation never occurred. Fourth, advocates who might speak on her behalf. Absent because her German attendants had been largely replaced by English ladies loyal to Henry. Every safeguard that might have protected a Tudor bride had been systematically removed or rendered meaningless. And the most chilling part? Anne didn't even know she needed protection. She went about her days as Queen of England, learning her new role, practicing her English, trying to please a husband who had already decided she was temporary. The spring of 1540 brought new complications. Or rather, it brought one specific complication. A 17-year-old girl with auburn hair and a vivacious manner. A girl who knew how to laugh at the king's jokes and make him feel young again. A girl who was, by complete coincidence, the niece of Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. Catherine Howard arrived at court as one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. It was a standard arrangement. Noble families placed their daughters and nieces in the Queen's household to give them exposure to court life, to make good marriages, to advance family interests. The Howards had been playing this game for decades. Anne Boleyn had been a Howard on her mother's side. Now another Howard girl was positioned close to the Queen, close to power, close to the King. Henry noticed her almost immediately. How could he not? Catherine was everything Anne was not. Young where Anne was mature, flirtatious where Anne was reserved, English where Anne was foreign, musical and accomplished in the courtly arts where Anne had none of those skills. Catherine knew how to dance, how to play instruments, how to engage in the witty banter that Henry had always loved. She also knew, because her family had certainly told her, exactly how to catch a king's eye. The Howard family had learned from Anne Boleyn's example that earlier Anne had used sexual unavailability as a tool, holding Henry at bay for years while she negotiated for marriage rather than mere mistress status. Catherine's approach was different. She was warm, accessible, affectionate. She made Henry feel desired. She didn't play games or demand commitments. She simply sparkled. And Henry, approaching 50 with a painful leg and a disappointing wife, found himself enchanted. By April 1540, the king was giving Catherine expensive gifts, jewels, lands, the kind of presents that signalled serious interest rather than casual flirtation. The court noticed. The court always noticed. Whispers began to circulate that the king had found a new favourite, that the German queen's position might not be as secure as it appeared. Anne noticed too, eventually, or at least she noticed that her husband's attention had shifted, that he seemed happier when Catherine Howard was nearby, that his visits to Anne's chambers grew less frequent, his manner more distant. But what could she do? She was a foreign queen in a court she barely understood, surrounded by people whose loyalties were uncertain. She had no power base, no faction to support her, no family members positioned in important places. She had only her gentle dignity, only her willingness to please, only her complete lack of understanding about how precarious her situation had become. Meanwhile, Thomas Cromwell was watching his world collapse. He had arranged the Cleves marriage. He had promised Henry that Anne would be suitable, that the alliance would be valuable, that everything would work out. Now the king was openly dissatisfied with his queen and openly infatuated with a Howard girl. The Howards were Cromwell's enemies. They were Catholic sympathisers, opponents of the Protestant reforms Cromwell had championed. If a Howard became queen, Cromwell's influence would evaporate. He tried to salvage the situation. He urged Henry to be patient. He emphasised the diplomatic advantages of the Cleves alliance. He pointed out that Anne was kind, that she was learning English, that she might yet produce an heir. Time, he argued. Give it time. But time was exactly what Henry didn't want to give. Every day with Anne was a day not spent with Catherine. Every night in Anne's bed, or rather, every night lying beside Anne without any intimate connection, was a night wasted. Henry was not a patient man. He had never been a patient man, and he was getting older. If he wanted more sons, if he wanted the dynasty secured, he couldn't afford to wait. The machinery of annulment began to move. June 1540, Henry ordered an investigation into his marriage. Officially, the question was whether the marriage had ever been valid in the first place. There had been a pre-contract, after all. Years earlier, Anne had been informally betrothed to the Duke of Lorraine's son. The betrothal had been abandoned, never formalised, but technically, might it constitute an impediment to her marriage to Henry? The lawyers would investigate. This was a familiar playbook. Henry had used pre-contracts before. He had argued that Catherine of Aragon's prior marriage to his brother Arthur invalidated her marriage to him. He had argued that Anne Boleyn's alleged pre-contract with Henry Percy meant their marriage was questionable. Pre-contracts were useful. They provided legal cover. They made annulment seem like matters of law rather than royal whim. But the pre-contract with Lorraine was thin, incomplete, probably not sufficient grounds for annulment on its own. Henry needed more. He needed consummation. Or rather, he needed the lack of consummation to be officially established, documented, testified to by credible witnesses. And this is where his wedding night strategy paid off brilliantly. Remember what Henry had done. He had dismissed all witnesses from the bedchamber. He had immediately begun confiding to advisers that consummation hadn't occurred. He had built over 6 months a consistent narrative supported by multiple testimonies from men who served at his pleasure. Now those testimonies could be collected, formalised, presented to the church courts as evidence. Thomas Cromwell testified. He recounted Henry's complaints from the very first night, how the king had said he liked Anne not, how he had described her body in unflattering terms, how he had claimed inability to perform the marital act. Dr. William Butts testified. He provided medical details, Henry's claims about nocturnal emissions, Henry's insistence that he remained capable with other women, Henry's description of Anne's physical characteristics that allegedly prevented arousal. Sir Anthony Denny testified. He described the wedding night itself, how Henry had ordered everyone away, how there had been no witnesses, how the king had emerged the next morning without making any announcement about consummation. Other gentlemen of the Privy Chamber testified. They had all heard the same complaints over the same 6 months. The king's disappointment, the king's inability, the king's growing certainty that this marriage would never produce the heirs England needed. The testimonies were damning. They were also completely one-sided. Every witness was a servant of the king. Every witness depended on Henry for their position, their income, their very lives. No one was going to contradict the royal narrative. And Anne still had no witnesses of her own. No one had been present on her wedding night to testify on her behalf. No one could say what had or hadn't happened behind that closed door. On July 6th, 1540, exactly 6 months after the wedding, Anne was informed that her marriage was under investigation. She was asked to provide testimony about her relationship with the king, about what had happened in the bedchamber, about whether the marriage had been consummated. Her responses revealed the full depth of her innocence. When asked if she was a true wife, Anne said yes. She described the king's kisses, his farewells, his sleeping beside her. She seemed genuinely confused by the questions. What more was there? What else should have happened? The investigators pressed her. Had the king known her carnally? Had there been physical union? Had the marriage been consummated in the full sense of the word? Anne's confusion deepened. She didn't entirely understand what they were asking. When the questions became more explicit, her answers made clear that nothing beyond sleeping had occurred. The king kissed her. The king said good night. The king slept. The king departed in the morning. That was all. That had always been all. She had thought that was marriage. She hadn't known anything was missing. The investigators must have felt some combination of pity and relief. Pity for this gentle woman who had been kept so ignorant she didn't even understand her own situation. Relief that she wasn't going to fight. She wasn't claiming consummation had occurred. She wasn't producing witnesses or evidence. She was simply, honestly, telling them that she didn't know what consummation meant. They ordered a physical examination. This was standard procedure in annulment cases where consummation was questioned. Midwives and physicians would examine the woman's body for evidence of sexual activity. In Anne's case, the examination was conclusive. She was a virgin, 6 months of marriage to the King of England, and she remained physically unchanged. No evidence of any sexual contact whatsoever. The marriage, whatever had happened in that bedchamber, on whatever nights Henry had visited, had never been consummated. The case for annulment was complete. On July 9th, 1540, convocation, the Assembly of English Church leaders formally declared Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves null and void. The grounds were twofold. First, the pre-contract with Lorraine, which they determined had created an impediment to the marriage. Second, and more importantly, the lack of consummation, which meant the marriage had never been truly realised. Anne was no longer queen. She had never been queen, legally speaking. The marriage had been invalid from the start. Any children she might have borne would have been illegitimate. The alliance with Cleves was null. The treaties signed on the basis of the marriage were void. All of it, the ceremony, the 6 months of playing queen, the gentle efforts to learn English and please her husband, had been legally meaningless. Henry was free. What happened next reveals something important about Anne of Cleves. Something about her intelligence, her survival instinct, her understanding of power, even if she hadn't understood marriage. She didn't fight. She didn't protest. She didn't attempt to claim the marriage had been consummated, didn't produce witnesses or evidence, didn't appeal to her brother in Cleves, or try to create a diplomatic incident. She read the situation correctly and made a calculated decision. Fighting would mean losing. Henry VIII did not lose annulment battles. Catherine of Aragon had fought for 6 years and lost everything: her title, her position, her daughter's legitimacy, eventually her life. Anne Boleyn had tried to maintain her position and lost her head. Fighting Henry meant destruction, but accepting might mean survival. Anne sent word to Henry that she accepted the annulment. She acknowledged that the marriage had not been consummated. She agreed that it should be declared void. She asked only for fair treatment. Henry was delighted. A compliant ex-wife was exactly what he wanted. No diplomatic complications. No appeals to foreign powers. No messy public battles. Just a quiet acceptance that the marriage had been a mistake. In return for her cooperation, Henry was extraordinarily generous. Anne received a settlement that made her one of the wealthiest women in England. She was given Hever Castle, the former home of the Boleyn family, with some irony. She received Richmond Palace and other properties. She was granted an income of £4,000 per year, a fortune by 16th century standards. She was given the title, the King's beloved sister. Not wife, not queen, but sister. A member of the royal family by courtesy, with all the privileges that implied. She would take precedence over every woman in England except the Queen and the King's daughters. She could remain in England for the rest of her life. She would be welcomed at court. She would be treated with honour and respect. All she had to do was accept that her marriage had never happened. Anne accepted. What choice did she have? What better outcome could she possibly achieve? She had entered a marriage she didn't understand, been trapped in a legal battle she couldn't win, and emerged with wealth, status, and her life. Compared to what had happened to other women who displeased Henry VIII, Anne had won. 16 days after the annulment, Henry married Catherine Howard. The wedding was small, private, conducted without the elaborate ceremonies of his previous marriages. Henry was in love. He called Catherine his rose without a thorn. He showered her with gifts and attention. He seemed happier than he had been in years. Anne attended the wedding. She gave Catherine gifts. She smiled and wished the couple well. The court watched this display of graciousness with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. How could she bear it? How could she watch her replacement marry her former husband and seem genuinely pleased? Perhaps Anne understood something the court didn't. Perhaps she recognized that her position was now more secure than Catherine's. She had wealth, property, independence. She had no husband to please, no expectations to meet, no heirs to produce. She was free in a way that Catherine Howard would never be free, and perhaps Anne sensed, with whatever political instinct she had developed, that Catherine's reign would not last, that Henry's roses had a tendency to develop thorns, that the Tower of London was full of women who had once been loved by the king. Anne settled into her new life with apparent contentment. She learned to speak English fluently. She entertained visitors at her various properties. She corresponded with her family in Cleves, assuring them she was well treated. She appeared at court occasionally, always gracious, always appropriate, always careful to maintain her position as the king's beloved sister. She watched as Henry's 5th marriage unravelled. Catherine Howard, it emerged, had a past. She had engaged in sexual relationships before her marriage. She had possibly continued inappropriate relationships after becoming queen. The evidence accumulated through the winter of 1541 and into 1542. By February 1542, Catherine Howard was dead, executed at the Tower, the same block, the same site, where Anne Boleyn had died 6 years earlier. Anne of Cleves was still alive, still wealthy, still free. Henry's sixth wife, Catherine Parr, would also survive him, but she did so by being nurse and companion to an aging, sick king, by suppressing her own religious opinions when they threatened to cause trouble, by being useful rather than beautiful. Anne had achieved survival through a different path, by being disposable, by being so easy to set aside that it wasn't worth the trouble to destroy her. But here's what makes Anne's story more than just a tale of one woman's survival. The legal weapon that Henry used against her, the absence of witnesses, the exploitation of her ignorance, the manipulation of testimony, these weren't unique to royal marriages. The same principles applied throughout Tudor society. The same vulnerabilities existed for any woman whose marriage might be questioned. 20 years after Anne's annulment, another woman would learn this lesson in devastating fashion. Lady Catherine Grey was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister Mary. After Elizabeth I became queen, Catherine was one of the strongest claimants to the throne. Elizabeth had no children. If she died without heir, Catherine Grey might become queen. This made Catherine dangerous. Elizabeth watched her closely, controlled her movements, restricted her marriage prospects. Catherine was not free to marry whom she chose. Any marriage Catherine made would need royal approval, would need witnesses, would need documentation. In 1560, Catherine fell in love with Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford. His family had its own claims to power. His uncle had been Lord Protector during Edward VI's minority. A marriage between Catherine Grey and Edward Seymour would unite two powerful bloodlines, two potential challenges to Elizabeth's rule. They married in secret. The ceremony was performed by a priest whose name they later couldn't remember. There was only one witness, a lady-in-waiting who would conveniently die before she could testify. No documentation was created. No public announcement was made. For months, Catherine and Edward kept their marriage hidden. But then Catherine became pregnant. She couldn't hide that. When Elizabeth discovered the pregnancy, she demanded proof of the marriage. Catherine couldn't provide it. The priest had disappeared, or perhaps had never existed in the form Catherine described. The only witness was dead. There was no documentation, no record, no proof that any ceremony had occurred. Catherine's word wasn't enough. Edward's word wasn't enough. Without witnesses, without evidence, the marriage couldn't be proven. Elizabeth's council declared the marriage invalid. Catherine's child would be illegitimate. Catherine herself was imprisoned in the Tower. She would spend the rest of her life in confinement. She gave birth in the Tower. Her son was declared a bastard. When she became pregnant a second time, Edward had been imprisoned nearby, and sympathetic guards had allowed them to meet. That child too was declared illegitimate. Catherine Grey died in 1568. Still a prisoner, she was 27 years old. She had committed no crime except loving a man and marrying him without proper witnesses. The system that had freed Henry VIII from an unwanted marriage had destroyed Catherine Grey's life. Do you see the pattern? The bedding ceremony, the witnesses, the documentation, all of it was theoretically designed to protect both parties, to ensure marriages couldn't be casually set aside, to protect women from being used and discarded, to protect the legitimacy of children. But the system only worked if both parties had equal access to its protections, if both parties could summon witnesses, create documentation, provide testimony that would be believed. When one party had power and the other didn't, the system became a weapon. Henry VIII dismissed witnesses because he could, because no one would stop him, because he knew his word would be believed over Anne's. The same system that should have protected Anne instead trapped her. She had no witnesses because her husband had sent them away. She had no understanding because her education had kept her ignorant. She had no voice because her voice didn't matter. Catherine Grey had no witnesses because she had married in secret, because she had been afraid of Elizabeth's reaction, because she had hoped to present the Queen with a fait accompli. Her secrecy, born of fear, became the weapon used against her. Without witnesses, without documentation, she had no protection. The law was the same in both cases. The outcomes couldn't have been more different. This was the world of Tudor marriage, a world where intimacy was legal transaction, where bedchambers were courtrooms, where witnesses could save you or their absence could destroy you, a world where the most private moment of a person's life could become evidence in a case that determined their entire future. Henry VIII understood this world perfectly. He had navigated it 6 times, escaping marriages, executing wives, manipulating the legal system to achieve whatever outcome he desired. When he dismissed the witnesses from his bedchamber on January 6, 1540, he wasn't just seeking privacy, he was removing Anne's protection. He was ensuring that whatever happened or didn't happen that night, he would control the narrative. 6 months later, his strategy succeeded completely. Anne had no witnesses. Anne had no understanding. Anne had no voice. The marriage was annulled. Henry was free. Anne survived because she chose not to fight a battle she couldn't win. But the lesson echoed through Tudor England for decades. Witnesses matter. Documentation matters. In a world where power was unequal, the formalities that seemed invasive or embarrassing might be your only protection. The story of Henry and Anne wasn't even the first time bedding witnesses had shaped the Tudor dynasty. Decades earlier, another wedding night had created questions that would haunt English history for years. In 1501, Prince Arthur, Henry VIII's older brother, married Catherine of Aragon. Arthur was 15 years old. Catherine was 16. The marriage united England and Spain in alliance. The wedding was celebrated with enormous pageantry, and the bedding ceremony followed proper protocol, with witnesses present to verify that the young couple had been put to bed together. But what happened after the witnesses withdrew? This question would become one of the most debated issues in English history. When Arthur died just 5 months after the wedding, Catherine was left a widow in a foreign land, and England faced a choice: send her back to Spain and lose the alliance, or keep her in England and marry her to the younger prince, the boy who would become Henry VIII. The problem was theological. Church law prohibited a man from marrying his brother's widow. The prohibition was based on Leviticus, on the idea that a brother's wife was forbidden as if she were blood relation. But there was an exception. If the first marriage had not been consummated, if Catherine remained a virgin, then she had never truly been Arthur's wife. The theological prohibition wouldn't apply, so had the marriage been consummated, Catherine said no. Consistently, repeatedly, for the rest of her life, Catherine of Aragon maintained that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. Arthur had been sickly, she said. He had been too weak to perform the marital act. They had slept in the same bed, yes, as the witnesses could confirm, but nothing more had occurred. She remained a virgin until her marriage to Henry. The witnesses supported, or at least didn't contradict, this claim. They had seen the young couple put to bed. They had heard nothing definitive that night. The servants who had attended Arthur in the morning reported, well, different things. Some servants claimed Arthur had emerged from the bedchamber boasting. He had reportedly said he had been in Spain that night, had asked for a drink because marriage was thirsty work. These reports suggested consummation had occurred. Other servants had no such memories. They recalled an ordinary morning, a prince who seemed no different than before. Arthur had been sickly throughout the winter. He had shown no signs of the exuberance one might expect from a young man who had just lost his virginity. The truth was unknowable. It had happened behind closed doors, in the privacy that the witnesses were supposed to respect. The witnesses had been present for the bedding. They had not been present for whatever followed. For 20 years, it didn't matter. Henry married Catherine in 1509, shortly after he became king. The Pope had issued a dispensation. setting aside any theological concerns about marrying a brother's widow. The marriage proceeded. Catherine became queen. She bore children, though most died young. She and Henry seemed for years to be happy. But then Henry wanted out. He wanted Anne Boleyn. He wanted a son. He wanted to be free of Catherine's aging body and constant disappointments. And suddenly, the question of Arthur's wedding night mattered desperately. If the marriage to Arthur had been consummated, then the papal dispensation had been insufficient. The prohibition against marrying a brother's wife was too strong to be set aside. Henry's marriage to Catherine was invalid, always had been invalid. Any children from that marriage, including the Princess Mary, were illegitimate. This was Henry's argument. This was the basis for his annulment request. And the evidence for consummation came from those servants who remembered Arthur's boasts, from the morning after comments about Spain and thirsty work, from the circumstantial evidence that two healthy teenagers, left alone in a bed, would naturally do what teenagers do. Catherine denied it. She swore on her immortal soul that she had come to Henry a virgin. She called on God as her witness. She maintained this position through years of legal battles, through separation from her husband, through exile from court, until her death in 1536. She never wavered. She never admitted that Arthur had consummated their marriage. But her denials weren't enough. Henry had witnesses. Henry had servants who would testify to Arthur's boasts. Henry had the weight of circumstance on his side, and Henry had power. The annulment from Catherine took 6 years to achieve. It required breaking with the Pope, establishing a new church, fundamentally reordering English religion and politics. But Henry got what he wanted. He always got what he wanted, and one of the key arguments, one of the pillars supporting his case, was the testimony about Arthur's wedding night. Witness testimony, morning after boasts, servants who remembered what their master had said decades earlier. This was the evidence that helped destroy Catherine of Aragon's marriage. Henry learned from this. Of course he did. He was many things: cruel, vain, desperate, dangerous. But he wasn't stupid. He understood how annulments worked. He had just spent 6 years building a case, marshalling evidence, navigating the complex intersection of theology and law. He knew exactly what kind of evidence mattered and what kind of testimony could make or break a case. When he married Anne of Cleves, he applied everything he had learned. He knew that witnesses could be dangerous. They might remember things incorrectly. They might be questioned years later and give inconvenient testimony. They might have loyalties that shifted over time. Better to have no witnesses at all. Better to control the narrative from the beginning. So he dismissed everyone from the bedchamber. He created the conditions for maximum ambiguity. And then, starting immediately the next morning, he began building his own case, confiding to Cromwell, consulting with physicians, establishing a consistent story that multiple witnesses could confirm. Not witnesses to the wedding night itself. No one could testify about what had or hadn't happened behind that closed door, but witnesses to the king's state of mind, witnesses to his complaints, witnesses to his claimed inability, witnesses who could say under oath that the king had told them from the very beginning that this marriage was unconsummated. It was masterful, it was calculated, and it worked perfectly. The contrast with Catherine of Aragon's situation is instructive. Catherine had fought because she believed she was right. She had fought because her daughter's legitimacy depended on the validity of her marriage. She had fought because she was Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and queens did not simply accept being set aside. But Catherine's fight had been hampered by the ambiguity of evidence. The witnesses from Arthur's wedding night were old men by the 1530s, remembering events from 3 decades earlier. Their memories were fallible. Their accounts contradicted each other. Some remembered Arthur's boasts, some didn't. Some thought consummation had occurred. Others believed Catherine's denials. Catherine could point to her own testimony, her sworn declarations that she had been a virgin, but Henry could point to the servants' memories, to the circumstantial evidence, to the natural assumption that young newlyweds would consummate their marriage. The evidence was mixed. The truth was unknowable. With Anne of Cleves, Henry made sure the truth would be whatever he said it was. No witnesses meant no contradictory testimony. His immediate complaints meant a documented record that supported his claims. Anne's ignorance meant she couldn't even accurately describe her own experience. The legal system hadn't changed between Catherine's annulment and Anne's. The requirements were the same, the procedures were the same, but Henry had learned to manipulate the system more effectively. He had learned to create favourable conditions before the battle even began. There's something chilling about watching a man apply lessons from one marriage to destroy another. Henry didn't stumble into the strategy that ended his marriage to Anne of Cleves. He planned it. He understood exactly what he was doing when he dismissed those witnesses. He understood exactly what kind of case he would need to make, and what evidence would support it. This wasn't a king who simply fell out of love and sought an exit. This was a king who constructed an exit before the marriage had even been tested, who created the legal conditions for annulment on the very night of his wedding, who walked into his bedchamber already planning how to walk out of his marriage. Anne never had a chance. Not really. From the moment Henry saw her at Rochester and decided he liked her not, her marriage was doomed. The only questions were how long it would take, and how thoroughly Henry would cover his tracks. The answer was 6 months and completely. But the lessons Henry learned from his marriages were absorbed by others too. His children watched. His court watched. Everyone who survived the Tudor marriage wars came away with an understanding of how dangerous matrimony could be, how easily it could be weaponized, how little protection the law actually provided against a determined opponent with power. Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, learned perhaps the most from her father's example. She had watched her mother go from queen to headless corpse in 3 years. She had watched her father marry 4 more times, discarding wives when they no longer served his purposes. She had been declared legitimate, then illegitimate, then legitimate again, her status shifting with her father's marriages and her father's whims. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, marriage was the central question of her reign. Everyone expected her to marry. A queen needed a king. A dynasty needed heirs. The pressure was constant, from her council, from Parliament, from foreign powers offering princes and archdukes as potential husbands. Elizabeth refused them all. For decades, historians have debated why Elizabeth never married. Some suggest she was in love with Robert Dudley and couldn't have him. Some suggest she had physical abnormalities that made marriage impossible or unwise. Some suggest she was simply too devoted to her power to share it with a husband. But consider what Elizabeth had witnessed. Consider what she understood about Tudor marriage. She knew that a wedding night would become a matter of state testimony. Witnesses would be present, or their absence would be noted. Whatever happened in the bedchamber would be documented, discussed, potentially used as evidence in future legal proceedings. She knew that consummation was a legal act, not a private one. Once she married, her intimate life would belong to the state. Physicians would monitor her cycles. Courtiers would speculate about her pregnancies. Every aspect of her married life would be subject to scrutiny and interpretation. She knew that wives were vulnerable. Her mother had been executed on charges of adultery that most historians believe were fabricated. Catherine Howard had been executed on similar charges that were probably true, but revealed through brutal interrogation of her ladies-in-waiting. The bedchamber was a dangerous place for a queen, and she knew that marriages could be unmade. Her father had annulled 2 marriages and executed 2 wives. The law provided far less protection than it promised. A woman who married a powerful man was at his mercy, whatever the ceremonies said. Elizabeth chose not to play the game at all. She remained the Virgin Queen, married to England, using her unmarried status as a diplomatic tool, while avoiding the vulnerabilities that marriage would bring. Her intimate life remained her own. No witnesses to summon, no testimony to contradict, no evidence to be manipulated by enemies. Some historians see this as tragedy. Elizabeth never knew love, never had children, let the Tudor dynasty die with her. But other historians see survival. Elizabeth reigned for 45 years, one of the longest and most successful reigns in English history. She died in her bed of old age, still queen. How many of her father's wives could say the same? The lessons of the bedding ceremony, of witnesses and testimony, and legal weapons disguised as protection, shaped not just individual marriages, but the course of English history. Henry's manipulation of his wedding nights contributed to his daughter's decision never to have a wedding night at all. But Elizabeth's choice was available only to a queen. Ordinary women couldn't simply opt out of marriage. For them, the system remained with all its vulnerabilities and all its potential for abuse. Consider what the bedding ceremony was supposed to accomplish. It was supposed to protect women by making marriages official and witnessed. A woman whose marriage was properly documented, properly witnessed, properly consummated before observers couldn't simply be set aside when her husband tired of her. She had proof, she had status, she had rights, but the system only worked when women had access to its protections, when witnesses were present who would later testify on their behalf, when documentation existed that couldn't be destroyed or denied, when the woman's word carried weight equal to her husband's. In practice, none of these conditions reliably held. Witnesses could be dismissed, as Henry had dismissed them. Documentation could be lost or never created, as with Catherine Grey. Women's testimony could be disbelieved or declared irrelevant, as with Anne of Cleves, whose own account of her marriage revealed only that she didn't understand what marriage meant. The system was designed for a world of equal parties, but Tudor marriage was never between equals. Husbands had power, wives had vulnerability, and the legal protections that seemed to favour women often became weapons in the hands of men. This pattern extended far beyond royal marriages. Throughout Tudor England, marriage cases came before church courts. Couples disputed whether marriages were valid. Women claimed they had been promised marriage and then abandoned. Men claimed their wives had been previously contracted to others. The questions were always the same. Were there witnesses? Was there documentation? Could the marriage be proven? Those who had witnesses survived these battles. Those who didn't lost everything. A woman who had been seduced with promises of marriage, who had given her virginity based on those promises, who had no witnesses to the promises made in private. She had no legal recourse, her word against his, and in Tudor courts that meant she lost. A wife whose husband decided to claim their marriage was invalid, who had been married quietly without proper ceremony, who couldn't produce the priest or the witnesses or the documentation, she might find herself declared never to have been a wife at all. Her children might be declared bastards, her property rights might be stripped away. The bedding ceremony, with all its invasiveness, existed precisely to prevent these situations, to create undeniable proof, to protect the vulnerable from the powerful. But the ceremony only worked when it was followed, when witnesses were present, when protocols were observed, when the powerful didn't simply dismiss the protections designed to constrain them. Henry VIII dismissed those protections because he could, because he was king, because no one was going to tell Henry VIII that he had to have witnesses in his bedchamber. But the principle he exploited wasn't unique to royalty. Any powerful man could do the same. Any man with enough authority to control who was present at his wedding, who attended his bedchamber, who would later testify about his marriage, that man could manipulate the system the same way Henry did. The legal historian Amy Erickson has documented how property law in Tudor England systematically disadvantaged women whose marriages were questioned. Without proof of valid marriage, women lost inheritance rights, lost dower rights, lost the property they had brought into the marriage. Everything depended on being able to prove the marriage had happened and had been consummated. The burdens of proof fell on women. The system asked them to document everything, to have witnesses for everything, to leave paper trails that could survive legal challenge. But the system also gave men the power to prevent that documentation, to dismiss witnesses, to conduct private ceremonies, to create exactly the conditions Henry created, conditions where the woman's word was all she had and her word wasn't enough. This is why Anne of Cleves' story matters beyond its drama and scandal. It reveals how systems designed to protect can become systems of control, how legal safeguards can be weaponized by those with power, how the most intimate moments of human life can be transformed into evidence, testimony, legal instruments. Anne stood in that bedchamber on January 6th, 1540, not knowing she was already trapped. The witnesses who should have protected her were walking away down corridors of Greenwich Palace, sent away by a king who understood exactly what he was doing. The ignorance that should have been replaced by knowledge on her wedding night remained intact, leaving her unable to understand her own situation. The documentation that should have secured her position was never created, leaving her defenseless against whatever claims Henry chose to make. She survived by accepting defeat gracefully, by recognizing that she couldn't win and choosing not to fight, by taking the settlement Henry offered and living out her days in comfortable irrelevance. It was the smartest move available to her, perhaps the only move available to her, but survival shouldn't require surrender. Protection shouldn't depend on the goodwill of those with power. A system that only works when the powerful choose to follow it isn't really a system at all. It's just another form of control, dressed up in the language of law and procedure. The summer of 1540 saw Henry VIII at the height of his manipulative powers. He had successfully annulled his fourth marriage. He had married Catherine Howard, the young bride who made him feel alive again. He had executed Thomas Cromwell, blaming him for the Cleves marriage that Cromwell had merely arranged at Henry's own command. Anne of Cleves remained in England, settling into her new properties, learning her new role as the king's beloved sister. She appeared at court occasionally. She dined with the king and his new queen. She played the part of the gracious ex-wife so perfectly that it became her permanent identity. Did she ever understand what had been done to her? Did she ever realize that Henry's wedding night strategy had been deliberate, that the absence of witnesses had been planned, that her legal destruction had been set in motion before the marriage was a day old? The historical record doesn't tell us. Anne left few letters, kept no diary that survives. We know she lived comfortably. We know she outlived Henry, survived his sixth wife's reign, watched the brief kingship of Edward VI, saw the accession of Mary I. She died in 1557, 17 years after her annulment, having never remarried, having never returned to Cleves, having made England her permanent home. Perhaps she understood everything and simply chose to accept it. Perhaps her survival instinct was so strong that she recognized the trap even as it closed around her and immediately began planning her escape through compliance. Or perhaps she never fully grasped how thoroughly she had been manipulated. Perhaps she went to her grave believing that her marriage had simply failed, that Henry had been unable to consummate it due to incompatibility rather than strategy, that the annulment had been a mutual acknowledgement of unfortunate circumstances rather than a legal execution planned from the beginning. We can't know what Anne understood. We can only know what happened. A king dismissed witnesses from his wedding night. A queen was left without protection. A marriage was annulled on the grounds of non-consummation, with no one able to testify otherwise. A woman survived by surrendering everything except her life. The pattern would repeat, in various forms throughout the Tudor era and beyond. Catherine Grey would lose everything because she lacked witnesses. Countless ordinary women would face church courts, unable to prove marriages that had happened in private. The system would continue to promise protection while delivering vulnerability. But understanding the pattern is the first step toward breaking it. Seeing how power was wielded, how protections were subverted, how the intimate was transformed into the legal, this understanding has value. It explains why certain formalities existed. Why witnesses mattered. Why documentation mattered. Why the seemingly intrusive rituals of marriage were, for many women, the only thing standing between them and ruin. The final years of Henry's reign were marked by decay. His leg wound worsened. His body swelled with fluid and fat. His temper, always dangerous, became increasingly volatile. He executed Catherine Howard in February 1542, less than 2 years after their marriage, when evidence emerged of her premarital sexual experiences and possible adultery during the marriage. His sixth wife, Catherine Parr, was a widow, older, sensible. She served as nurse and companion more than wife. She had her own religious convictions, strong Protestant beliefs that occasionally put her in danger, but she learned to suppress them when necessary. She survived by being useful, by being careful, by never giving Henry reason to doubt her loyalty. Catherine Parr understood what Anne of Cleves had learned. Survival required accepting the terms set by those with power. Fighting meant destruction. The only way to win was to not play the game, or to play it so carefully that you never gave your opponent an opening. When Henry died in January 1547, he left behind a transformed England, a new church independent of Rome, a dynasty hanging by a thread dependent on a sickly 9-year-old boy, a court full of people who had survived by learning exactly how power worked and how to avoid being destroyed by it, and 4 surviving ex-wives or widows, each carrying different lessons from their time with Henry. Catherine of Aragon had died in exile, defeated but unbroken in her conviction that she had been true queen. Anne Boleyn had died on the scaffold, destroyed by accusations most historians believe were false. Jane Seymour had died in childbirth, the only wife to give Henry what he wanted, and pay the ultimate price for it. Anne of Cleves had survived through surrender. Catherine Howard had died young, punished for a past she couldn't escape. Catherine Parr had survived through caution. Each of these women encountered the intersection of intimacy and law in different ways. Each discovered how the private could become political, how the personal could become legal, how the bedroom could become a courtroom. But Anne of Cleves' story remains unique because it shows the system being deliberately gamed from the beginning. Not a marriage that failed and then required legal resolution. Not a wife who gave offence and then faced charges. But a husband who created the conditions for annulment before the marriage was consummated, who dismissed witnesses not out of modesty but out of strategy, who planned his exit before he'd entered the relationship. This is what power looks like when it's truly unchecked. Not reactive but proactive. Not responding to circumstances but creating them. Not fighting battles but ensuring they can never be lost. Henry VIII walked into his bedchamber on January 6, 1540, and sent the witnesses away. In that simple act, he sealed Anne's fate. Everything that followed, the 6 months of pretense, the annulment proceedings, the generous settlement, the rest of Anne's life as the king's beloved sister, all of it flowed from that moment. From a closed door and an empty antechamber, the servants who walked away that night must have wondered what was happening. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't how royal weddings worked. But they were servants, and servants didn't question kings. They withdrew to wherever they spent that cold January night, perhaps speculating among themselves about what it meant, perhaps simply grateful not to be standing in an antechamber waiting for sounds they'd rather not hear. Did any of them understand that they were being removed as potential witnesses? Did any of them realize that their absence would later become evidence in a legal case? Probably not. How could they? They were observing the breakdown of protocol without understanding the strategy behind it. But their absence spoke volumes in the annulment proceedings. When the investigators asked whether there were witnesses to the wedding night, the answer was no. When they asked whether anyone could testify to consummation, the answer was no. When they asked whether any evidence existed beyond the king's word and the queen's confused innocence, the answer was no. No witnesses, no testimony, no evidence. Just a king who had been building his case for 6 months, and a queen who didn't understand she needed to build one at all. The legal historian David Loades has noted that Henry VIII's annulment from Anne of Cleves was remarkably smooth compared to his other marital dissolutions. The break with Catherine of Aragon had required years of struggle and a religious revolution. The destruction of Anne Boleyn had required manufactured charges of treason and adultery, a public trial, and execution. Even the relatively simple death of Jane Seymour had created succession complications that wouldn't be fully resolved for decades. But Anne of Cleves? Announced in June, investigated in July, annulled within weeks. Anne's cooperation helped, certainly. Her willingness to accept the verdict prevented diplomatic complications. But the real reason for the speed was the strength of Henry's case. He had created the perfect conditions for annulment. No witnesses to contradict his claims. Immediate documentation of his complaints. A wife who couldn't testify coherently about her own experience. Medical examination confirming virginity. Every element aligned perfectly. This wasn't luck. This was strategy. Henry had learned from his previous marriages what worked and what didn't. He had applied those lessons to create an airtight case before the marriage was a day old. The smoothness of the annulment was proof of how thoroughly Henry had manipulated the system. Not proof of his innocence, proof of his guilt. When we think about historical injustice, we often focus on violence, executions, wars, the dramatic moments when power becomes visibly deadly. But there's another kind of injustice, quieter but equally destructive. The injustice of systems designed to protect being turned against those they should protect. Anne of Cleves wasn't executed. She wasn't imprisoned. She wasn't even particularly mistreated by Tudor standards. She received wealth, status, a comfortable life. Many women in her position would have envied her outcome, but she was still wronged. Her marriage was dissolved not because it had failed, but because it had been designed to fail. Her protections were removed not by accident, but by plan. Her future was determined not by her choices, but by someone else's strategy. She survived. But survival isn't justice. The story of Henry VIII's fourth wedding night illuminates something important about how power operates in intimate spaces. It shows us that the personal has always been political, that the private has always been subject to public interpretation, that the bedroom has always been a site of legal and social meaning. The bedding ceremony existed because society understood these truths. Witnesses existed because marriages had consequences beyond the couple involved. Documentation existed because memory was fallible and power was corruptible. Every formal element of marriage law existed because people understood that without formality, without witnesses, without proof, the vulnerable would be at the mercy of the powerful. Henry VIII understood this too. He understood it well enough to subvert it, to use his power to remove the protections designed to constrain power, to create a situation where his word was the only word that mattered. Anne of Cleves stood alone in that bedchamber, because Henry had sent everyone else away. She remained alone, legally and practically, for the rest of her life. The king's beloved sister, never again a wife, never a mother, comfortable but contained, surviving but not truly free. This was the cost of Henry's strategy. Not just a marriage dissolved, but a life constrained. Anne of Cleves spent 17 years after her annulment, living in a kind of comfortable limbo. She was welcome at court but not central to it. She was wealthy but not powerful. She was titled but not married. She existed in a category Henry had invented for her, the king's beloved sister, a position without precedent or clear meaning. She could not return to Cleves without creating diplomatic complications. Her brother, the Duke, had been embarrassed by the annulment. Taking Anne back would have meant acknowledging the failure of the alliance, would have meant accepting that England had used and discarded a German princess. It was easier for everyone if Anne remained in England, if she played the role Henry had assigned her, if she pretended that her peculiar status was something she had chosen rather than something that had been forced upon her. So she stayed. She learned English fluently. She developed friendships among the English nobility. She entertained visitors at her properties, managed her estates, lived the life of a wealthy English noblewoman. When she appeared at court, she was gracious and appropriate. When she encountered her successor queens, she was polite and unremarkable. She watched Catherine Howard rise and fall. She watched Catherine Parr navigate the dangerous waters of being Henry's wife. She watched the king grow old, grow sick, grow increasingly unpredictable. And through it all, she maintained her position. The beloved sister, the comfortable exile, the woman who had learned that survival required acceptance. Henry died on January 28th, 1547. He was 55 years old, ancient by Tudor standards, bloated and diseased. His final years had been marked by paranoia, by sudden rages, by the execution of former friends, and the destruction of former allies. Thomas Cromwell had been executed in 1540, blamed for the Cleves marriage. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, had narrowly escaped execution in 1547, saved only by Henry's death. The court had become a dangerous place, full of factions and conspiracies, where survival depended on reading the king's mood and never giving offence. Anne of Cleves survived all of it. She was far enough from the centre of power that the factional battles passed her by. She had no influence to be fought over, no position to be threatened. Her comfortable irrelevance protected her from the dangers that destroyed others. When the young Edward VI became king, Anne's position remained stable. She was still the king's aunt, technically the sister of his father by courtesy if not by law. She continued her quiet life, appearing occasionally at court, maintaining her properties, living within her generous income. When Mary I took the throne in 1553, Anne might have been nervous. Mary was Catherine of Aragon's daughter, the woman whose legitimacy had been destroyed by her father's marital manipulations. Mary might have resented Anne as part of the system that had displaced her mother, but Mary showed Anne only kindness. Perhaps Mary understood that Anne too had been a victim of Henry's machinations. Perhaps Mary appreciated that Anne had never challenged Catherine's position, had been dealt with quickly and cleanly rather than through years of painful struggle. Anne attended Mary's coronation. She rode in a place of honour. Whatever complicated feelings might have existed between them, they were set aside for ceremony. The king's beloved sister had become the queen's honoured guest. Anne died on July 16th, 1557, at her manor house in Chelsea. She was 41 years old. The cause of death isn't recorded with certainty, but some accounts suggest cancer. She had been ill for some time, had drawn up her will carefully, had made provisions for her servants and dependents. She was buried at Westminster Abbey, the only one of Henry's 6 wives to be buried there. Catherine of Aragon was buried at Peterborough Cathedral. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London, near the site of their executions. Jane Seymour was buried at Windsor Castle. Catherine Parr was buried at Sudeley Castle. But Anne of Cleves, the wife who was never really a wife, received the honour of Westminster, perhaps because she had lived longest after Henry's death, perhaps because she had remained in England, had become part of the English establishment in a way the other wives never could, perhaps because the living Mary wanted to honour this gentle woman who had navigated so much difficulty with such grace. Or perhaps it was simply because Anne had won, in her own quiet way. She had outlived everyone who had tried to control her fate. She had survived the king who had manipulated her. She had survived the minister who had arranged her marriage and been executed for it. She had survived the young queen who had replaced her and been executed in turn. She had survived them all. Survival was its own victory. Westminster Abbey was its recognition. What do we make of Anne of Cleves's story, looking back across 5 centuries? It's tempting to see her as a passive victim, a woman who was used and discarded by forces beyond her control. And there's truth in that view. She was brought to England for diplomatic purposes, judged inadequate on arrival, trapped in a marriage that was designed to fail, and set aside when she was no longer useful. Her voice barely appears in the historical record. Her desires, her thoughts, her feelings, we can only guess at them from her actions. But there's another way to see Anne, as a survivor, as someone who read her situation correctly and responded with intelligence and pragmatism, as a woman who understood that fighting Henry VIII meant destruction and chose a different path. She couldn't control what Henry did on their wedding night. She couldn't summon witnesses who had been dismissed. She couldn't understand what she had never been taught. But when the annulment came, when she was offered the choice between fighting and accepting, she chose the option that let her live, and not just live, thrive in her own way. She had wealth and independence in an era when most women had neither. She had freedom from the constraints of marriage in an era when wives were subject to their husbands in all things.